Today's session is on a topic that is very close to my heart. As you may know, most of the recent discussions in international development have been about promoting evidence-informed decisions by policymakers and implementers from low and middle-income countries. Probably a lot of you have sat in on countless webinars in 2020 discussing this topic. What has been less discussed is the practice and the decisions taken by international development institutions. To what extent are data and research used to diagnose and address problems in their country programming and their development work? So today we will discuss how institutions can incentivize, put systems in place, and train people in using research and evidence to design the best possible interventions, policies, and programs, and to ensure continuous monitoring, evaluation, learning, and adaptations, so as always to strive to support the most cost-effective development programs. In my previous roles as Director of Evaluation at NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and as Manager of Evaluations at the World Bank, I put in place evaluations of the learning culture in these institutions. A common finding was that while there were pockets of good practice and many development practitioners were very dedicated to ensuring the best possible development outcomes were achieved, the institutional incentives and signals from the leadership were not necessarily aligned to promoting a culture of learning and evidence-informed development. Now, it is hard to change cultures, and we have the best possible panel with us today, with some of the biggest names and representatives of organizations known to steer international development presently. And they will help us grapple with this issue and hopefully hear about some promising approaches. In the spirit of continuous learning and to keep the suspense till the end of the panel, each panelist will, at the end of today's panel, be asked to commit to one thing they have learned from the panel today that they would like to try out over the course of the next year. And they've also committed to come back a year from now to report to us on what happened. So that will be quite exciting. So let me now introduce this excellent panel. I'm happy to welcome Kumar Iyer, the Director General Delivery at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or also known as FCDO. Alison Evans, who is the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. Mark Sundberg, the Chief Economist at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and also the Deputy Vice President, Department of Policy and Evaluation at the MCC. Stacy Young from USAID, who is the Agency Knowledge Management and Organizational Learning Officer. And Håvard Mokleiv Nygaard, the new Director of Knowledge and Evaluation at NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. So welcome to the whole panel. Their detailed bios, which are long and very interesting, are available in the link provided by my colleagues in the chat. In terms of a few notes on housekeeping, before we kick off the panel discussions, here are a few rules and a few things to note. When sending a question to the panelists, please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. And please also remember to name the panelists you would like a response from. And also to manage expectations, we will not get to all the questions, probably be able to take just 3 or 4. But please do send them, and we will try to take a few of the most interesting and the ones we have time for. If you are joining our event via live stream on YouTube or any other social media platform, please leave your questions in the comment section. In addition, we also encourage you to tweet any questions, point of views on Twitter. And then please tag @3IE News while you tweet and use the hashtag EvidenceDialogues because we would really like and love to hear what you have to say. So with that, let's jump straight in. Let's start with you, Alison. Based on your role as what I would call evaluator-in-chief, if I may, both for UK aid in your previous position and then more recently at the World Bank, what have you found to be the current state of critical thinking and evidence-informed development work in the two organizations, so World Bank and what used to be DFID, now FCDO? Are there any common insights, and are there any particular differences that you would emphasize?
So thank you so much, Marie, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this panel discussion with peers from across institutions and the evidence community, and great to see so many people online watching this. So a few points really to set the scene, and as I do that, a quick health warning that, you know, this is a huge agenda. These are large institutions we're talking about, and anything I say in a way risks being a little partial, but hopefully we can flesh things out as the discussion gets going. So I think the first thing to say is that the development institutions I know best are in fact rich in data and evidence, to the point of being positively noisy evidence environments. And they're made up also of a lot of highly motivated staff. You mentioned that in your introduction, Marie, you know, motivated by mission and the commitment to doing a good job. And I think when asked, staff in these institutions are motivated by the power of evidence-informed development. And the World Bank Group itself is a huge producer of data and evidence for public consumption. Secondly, these development institutions devote real resources to producing a wide range of evidence types. This was true when I worked at ICAI in DFID. I suspect things are changing a little bit now as the environment changes, but the World Bank Group, for example, commits about $1 billion a year to various kinds of knowledge activities and knowledge products. This is a huge enterprise. Thirdly, a lot of that investment, impossible to say exactly how much actually, focuses on building a body of evidence about the development challenges partner and client countries face, and sharing, you know, global, regional and country experience about potential pathways through those challenges. This is vital work, and it gets crystallized in a set of very sophisticated diagnostic tools and analytical processes that inform selectivity, prioritization around policy dialogue, partnering and convening, and also around the shape and focus of country programs. Fourthly, each institution, that was DFID then and the World Bank Group now, has a pretty sophisticated and extensive corporate results system, which includes, in the World Bank Group at least, a very comprehensive self-evaluation system that creates a context for the use of evidence in informing what to do, how to do it, and how the right results are achieved. And by the metrics that populate these results systems, these organizations are actually high performers. And I suspect you're waiting now for a bit of a but, so here it comes. My fifth point is that in reality, the relationship between evidence and its use is just not simple. And even with a comprehensive framework, such as a corporate results system, it can break down or it can function poorly, particularly where it narrows to hitting targets over taking on board evidence that may question or open up new avenues of debate or critical thinking about what to do and how to do it. And this is particularly a challenge, I think, in the large organizations like the World Bank Group. So what these organizations have in common, in fact, is that they tend, I think, to give more credence to evidence that informs understanding of development issues than they do to evidence on how well they work to tackle those issues. Which means that with all the evidence produced, that very noisy evidence environment, actually when it comes down to it, you know, using evidence on decisions to continue programming, scale up, scale down, or close an operation, it's much less clear how evidence influences decisions and behaviors. Now, in the review that ICAI led back, I think in 2014 now, on how DFID learns, this was summarized in the phrase that it's difficult to identify how investment in evidence and learning links to performance and delivery for better impact. And while we know that good data and evidence via operational monitoring and evaluation, for example, boosts the performance of operations, it's actually hard to pinpoint at scale the delta in terms of development effectiveness that comes from more and better evidence. And this is something that we're constantly grappling with in the World Bank Group. It's also the case that while these institutions have built an organizational infrastructure to support use of evidence, lots of emphasis on systems and tools and so on, actually, there's a point where this infrastructure can actually lead to rigidities and over-determined systems that in turn actually become burdensome. I'm thinking there of the early stages of the results system in DFID, but also the disincentives that we find, the feeding the beast problem that we often find in the World Bank Group. And of course, this risks delinking operational staff from using evidence for that double loop learning, which is asking what is going on here, what are we missing, do our assumptions still hold, and what else do we need to make an informed judgment. So while these institutions have these corporate results systems that are very helpful and really important for public accountability, they're actually not the best systems to assure evidence-informed and adaptive decision-making. And I think that's really what we're striving for. So finally, I think one way to support this, and something we increasingly thinking about, is how to get evidence and learning to support space and skills for judgment that staff and managers and clients need to use in real time through interrogating and applying evidence to specific, be it design or implementation problems, in a framework of mutual accountability. And there's no single recipe for this, but it does require the right leadership. It definitely requires looking at how incentives function and moving beyond sort of generic ticking of boxes to say that evidence has been taken into account, to something that really does support the intrinsic motivations of staff to use evidence to do better. And finally, it needs an organizational environment that encourages asking the right questions. Has evidence informed what we're doing? What do we know? What do we don't know, in order to do and do better? I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. This is excellent as a scene setting, I think, for the further discussion. And I think it would be very interesting now, turning also then now to Kumar. Here you are at, well, now FCDO, which is a new incarnation partly of DFID. So, you know, you heard what Alison talked about in terms of sort of, you know, systems then potentially leading to rigidity, and how do we sort of, how do we build that sort of culture of questioning, of bringing in judgment, etc. So, you know, and I'm thinking you have an interesting job. You're Director General for Delivery at FCDO, and you have very, as you said, very extensive responsibilities, including, among others, development policy and prioritization, implementation, innovation and research, evidence and data. So you have all of this under your hat, so to speak, and of course this all of this against a heightened focus on value for money. So to be a bit challenging, I mean, from an outsider's perspective, it seems like you are in a position where you can decide on the processes and the incentives required to ensure evidence, the type of evidence used, in the sense that Alison was also talking about here, the one where you bring judgment and questioning, etc., and then ensure continuous learning within FCDO. So to what extent is that the case, and what are the various factors that you will have to take into account and juggle in your position?
Thanks, Marie. Really, really good questions. I mean, look, as you outlined, it is very much the task at hand, and there is a reason why those functions come under a DG area with the single title delivery, because really what counts at the end of the day is the difference and the impact you make on the ground. We want to be best practice in how we do that. We want to draw on the best evidence, and we want to have thoughtful and sensitive approaches and processes in the way in which we deliver as well. And so, you know, how do you make sure evidence is embedded within all of that? I mean, I often, my personal sort of mental framework for thinking about how you create that kind of culture and how you drive that kind of change or sustain a situation that is good, which is essentially where it is with the SEDO and its, as you say, predecessor organization DFID, is I think about it in terms of head, heart, and guts. You've got to have a clear vision in terms of what you're aiming for, and there's got to be a clear rationale around it. You've got to have an emotional case. I think just the pure analytical case doesn't work, and you've got to explain to people, and you've got to make them want it. And actually, we're really lucky, as Alison said, we've got a range of staff that are really committed on multiple levels, and it's probably why we all do what we do, because we're committed on multiple different levels. And then the guts. You've got to have those processes. You've got to have guidance that people want to read. You've got to have different ways of delivering it. You've got to have the incentives right. You've got to, and we could keep going through that. But what I would say is that that the importance of evidence is something that cuts across everything we do, and it continues to be an area that we invest in. Let me sort of pull out a few ways of let me focus a little bit on the guts around, and in terms of how do we think about this? We think about the use of research and evidence throughout the if you like the life cycle, the project delivery cycle, and it is the first thing, and one of the areas we emphasize it very heavily is around the concept note, because before anything has got off the ground, we want to know why people are suggesting what it is that they are suggesting. Just right at the beginning, we don't really let things get off the ground without evidence being incorporated right at the beginning. We find that if you let things get started without asking those questions, then it's very hard. People start to reverse engineer logic, and you find that the momentum builds, and it's quite hard to pull things back. There's a challenge there, which is how do you, if you're going to set those high standards, how do you create the space for risk taking? How do you create the space for a little bit of creativity at the margins as well? And in that, what we do is we really think about asking people to be clear about the scale of the investment and the program. And again, if you're experimenting, you should probably start smaller. You need to design your program accordingly. And be open about where the evidence does and doesn't take you, or where you are actually, in some cases, testing the evidence and the state of play at the margin. At the business case stage, absolutely. We want people to be able to demonstrate far more clearly how the evidence is supporting the value for money framework, and it's a thing that cuts across all of UK government activity. We have a particular document on the VFM framework around how we spend ODA, and it is, money doesn't get spent without it, so it sort of sits there and is very much incorporated within our thinking at that stage, and it's based around economy. So our inputs of appropriate quality being minimized, being delivered at the right price. So we have a look at sort of our evidence supporting that. We look at efficiency on how those inputs are being converted into the outputs and outcomes, and what is the evidence that underpins that. And we also look at effectiveness, which is it's the outputs to outcomes, if you like, ratio as well. And we try and build up a picture across the activity chain, because not all of the things that you, and I'll come on to evaluation and monitoring in a moment, but you can't measure and track everything that you want. But if you've got the right evidence that says how different elements should be linking and working together as you deliver, then you can have more confidence by only being able to monitor closely, or monitor on a higher frequency, say, a handful of variables. And so if you've got your theory of change really clearly set out at the beginning, that helps you as you are monitoring your delivery. And that brings me to the sort of the third bit. We have annual reviews for every single one of our programs, and we have project completion reviews as well for every single one of our programs. We obviously, the scale of involvement and depth varies based on two factors: one, the size of those programs, and two, the risk monitoring that we do as well. So we take a risk-based approach to that too. But that sort of continuous life cycle and linking the evidence through to the delivery is absolutely key for us. I think a few other things around the guts to sort of highlight. One of the things that I know that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is how do you get the IT and the technical platform right to make this possible and manageable for everyone. It's not trivial, but it comes down to those nuts and bolts sometimes in terms of how easy you can make this for people in terms of the monitoring and the tracking. And I think that often helps when we are, Alison quite rightly pulled up the trade-off sometimes between the targets and the evidence. And I'm really keen on adaptive programming and being able to adjust and move as time goes by. But in order to be able to do that, you need the information, you need the data, you need the culture, and there is always a technology element to that. I'm going to pause there. I think I've gone over time anyway, Marie, but I'll hand back to you on that next.
No, thanks very much, Kumar, and I think that's extremely helpful. I was just, I love the head, hearts, and guts, and the emotional case part that you were making, and I kept thinking sort of how do you measure that, going now to Mark, still thinking about the emotional case, because MCC is an interesting organization, among others, in that it has put evidence at the center of decision making. And MCC requires that its project's economic rate of return, and I can't sort of think of a less emotional case than the economic rate of return. That's why I'm bringing it up. It's a single metric that's showing how a project's economic benefit compares to its costs. That it need to pass a 10% hurdle rate to be considered for investment. I know there are other considerations, and you're going to be talking about that, but I just find that that is a very specific thing that MCC is doing there. So what has this kind of clear incentive meant for evidence use and learning? And as usual, when you put these kind of incentives, there's always an unintended effect from any incentive. So what are the unintended effects of such incentives? So over to you, Mark.
Oh, that's a big question. But first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to join this panel. It's a great opportunity to learn from others and pull from evidence and thoughts that you all share into how we can think about work at MCC. You asked about the ERR, and I think in some ways MCC is unique in how central and important the ERR is. But I'd like to step back from that and focus on your point and introduction about the use of evidence through what's really a very attenuated chain from the development of a budget that starts in Congress all the way to implementing, then evaluating projects in countries at the end of that. The ERR is a great disciplining tool for this, but all along this evidence chain, I think there are opportunities, and MCC has really placed that evidence at the center of each step, starting with selection of countries that we work with. The scorecard system, which is used to determine eligibility and selection of countries, is very intentionally driven by 20 independently collected indicators that are mapped to what we take as expectations around aid effectiveness, linked to governance, to transparency in civil society, to apparent commitments of government to invest in its people through education budgets and health, etc. And that's an important disciplining source of selection that helps to depoliticize the selection of countries. There's no sort of colonial link to where we allocate resources, for example. The second, the sort of second problem that you face is when you go into a country and you're thinking about how do you allocate a scarce grant resource, and MCC is pure grant. How do you allocate that across what are needs in pretty much any direction you look? And that's where MCC has chosen to use this constraints to growth analysis as a disciplining tool to try to take evidence and a hard look at what would lead to the conclusion that investing in power versus health versus transportation or even governance elements itself is going to have the largest growth impact for the dollar going into that. And that's a very important exercise that is helping us select sectors. The next question or the next problem is, how can you sustainably address that constraint? And we use a tool called root cause analysis, but it's trying to get at what are very complex systems that lead to the constraints that are evident. And it requires then that we use, or there are various tools that we use, the fishbone analysis or systems thinking, systems design approach to get that complexity, but working with multiple stakeholders and to try to kind of rigorously map out what are the determining factors that lead to that constraint. I would argue that that's not a single step. That's something that continues throughout your years of engagement with the country, but it's a very important way of getting into how do you then want to design interventions that will sustainably get at the root causes of constraints. Then the fourth problem is, related to this question about how do you demonstrate value for money? And that's where the ERR has a really critical role to play. I don't want to overemphasize this, but so much around decision-making does depend on the rigor and theory of change that gets embodied in that modeling exercise. And I would say it's a heuristic. It needs to be seen as a way to put thinking together and to bring various disciplines that are around a project space, the engineers, the sector specialists, the economists, and eventually sort of decision makers to think through how this project will impact on the country's growth opportunity. And lastly, of course, how do you model monitoring and evaluation? Because that's very closely linked to how the economic rate of return modeling is put together. And you need to link these elements together. I want to just mention sort of three takeaways. The one point is that rigorous use of evidence, I think, helps to really depoliticize our work. And in a political environment, which is quite heated in the United States, having bipartisan support from Congress is critical to sort of survival of the agency, but it even helps depoliticize decision-making within the agency. It's an important disciplining point. The second one is, to focus along evidence, on evidence along this full chain of decision-making. It isn't one point in it. It really applies and is critical to keep in mind. And the third thing I would just return to is thinking about, tools that have been both derided and praised, like economic rate of return analysis, is disciplining, but it is a heuristic, and it shouldn't be the enemy of innovation. It shouldn't be preventing us from using evidence to think outside the box as well, and to use it also as a sounding board to challenge some of the premises that underlie our theory of change. Let me stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you, Mark. I think I can already see a tweet after the end of this webinar, because evidence helps depoliticize decision making. I think is just an excellent point. Both what Mark has talked about and Kumar and also Alison is these institutions have put a lot of systems in place to try to sort of ensure use of evidence into the sort of project cycle. And turning to you, Håvard, NORAD has a little bit of a different approach, or at least that's my take on it, and has traditionally been sort of an institution more focused on supporting development through partnerships, wherein the partners, in a sense, are responsible for most of the evidence use and learning, while at the central level, the focus has mainly been on managing the partnerships on one hand, but also on sort of monitoring things like zero corruption, ensuring zero corruption, for example. And the new Director General in NORAD, or rather recent, is keen to turn NORAD into more of a knowledge and evidence-informed institution. And your role that combines evaluation and knowledge will presumably play a key role in that regard. And so how do you anticipate going about contributing to creating a culture of evidence use and learning in the rest of the organization?
Thank you, Marie. I guess to echo Mark, that's a big question. I'll try to ease into some of that. Although I'd actually like to start by saying, as my panelists have done before me, thank you for inviting me. This is a fantastic opportunity and a great panel. I also should start by saying that I feel a little bit like a free rider right here and now. I'm still fresh, I think I can say, in my job. I've been in this position for less than a month. So I have a billion questions, and I don't even have a fraction of that many answers. So, but I have. So the benefit of that is that I still have a little bit of an outsider's view, and I can, shoot from the hip. The stupid things I say, you'll just have to, this just because of my naivety and lack of knowledge. And when we meet again in a year, I'll be much better informed. But as Marie said, I'm the director of knowledge and evaluations. I'm actually the first director of knowledge. The knowledge part is the new part, and evaluation at NORAD. And as many of you know, NORAD already has and has had for a long time if I can say so myself, a stellar reputation when it comes to evaluation. And of course, a big part of my job is to build on that and continue ensuring that NORAD does top-notch, independent, high-quality evaluation. But there's a growing realization that there's somewhat of a gap between the evaluation part and the knowledge part, which is where these new signals that are coming from the new Director General of NORAD are important. And NORAD also launched its new strategy just a couple of days ago, actually. And that strategy has 5 pillars. And one of those pillars is that NORAD is to become a base and a hub for the strengthening and development of knowledge for the entire sector. And Marie, you're absolutely right that NORAD is kind of a different beast here in that we very consistently, work through partners to an extremely small extent that we implement anything on the ground. So that means that when I think about, so I like to think about the value chain of knowledge, that goes from I really like what Kumar said about getting the evidence already at the concept note level, So take that value chain from that very moment through the conception of the project, through the hopeful real-time evaluation that goes on during the project to change course if needed, through the end research and evaluation that's done in the end, and then the feedback loop down to the next. Now, if you were just implementing projects, then you had one such loop or one such chain. But my chain goes through 2 axes, basically. One is the simple over across time value chain, but then the chain also goes through all the partners, and often it's partners embedded in partners who are actually implementing everything on the ground. So what we are trying to do, or what I'm thinking about a lot these days is so I can do a lot internally with my staff, but to really get this to work, we need a similar level of evidence thinking to basically tinkle through this entire chain all the way to the ground. And that's a fascinating challenge, but it should also be said that there's good reasons for why NORAD chooses to work through these partners, because they also very often have amazing and fantastic networks on the ground. They are very close to the issues. They are they have maybe to a larger extent they have they know the context. They have maybe even skin in the game in a different way than we do, and having those perspectives is extremely useful when you sit here up in the high north. But it does mean that you have to work with these partners all the way down to get it to working. That creates a particular set of challenges. And NORAD, as many other aid organizations, have, over the last few years, or a few more years, really focused and honed in on these issues of results-based management. And we collect a lot of results data. What we know, though, is that there's something wrong, to be very frank and very honest, with that data collection. Fantastic evaluations that my department have done, maybe even when you were the director, Marie, have looked at the results-based management, and there's big flaws in how it's working right now. Part of it really comes down to simple, to some extent, simple issues around collection of data and what types of data we are actually collecting. But then, increasingly, I'm realizing that this is a trivial thing to say, but I think it's still important, is that data isn't knowledge, right? To me, data is like the atoms that create knowledge. But right now, I have this feeling that we're both getting the atoms to some extent wrong. So we're very often measuring the wrong things, but then how we're handling that data. So the kind of measurements we're doing, the kind of analysis we're doing, the kind of other secondary data that we're combining with, all the fancy stuff you can do these days with geospatial analysis, et cetera. We're not leveraging all of the data that we have to produce the knowledge that we need to really do the way we need to do evidence-based development. And I think one thing that also very much screams at me these days is Mark mentioned the issue of complex systems, and I think that's extremely important to keep in mind, right? And the central feature, right, of a complex system is that the output is not proportional to the input. And that creates both challenges on the measurement side. It creates challenges on the analysis side. It creates challenges on the how do we handle the uncertainty around the results that we're getting side, and that feeds up all the way up to the big policy decisions that even the minister makes. And I really do have a sense, again, shooting from the hip, being naive from the outside, I really do have a sense that we have a way to go when it comes to really coming to terms with and grappling these issues of how do we deal with evidence around what is inherently complex systems. And then I'm also, increasingly cognizant of the fact that what we have in the end very often is almost, to me, seems like a choice between being roughly right on something or exactly wrong on something that you might be both exactly wrong on, and it's also completely irrelevant. But I think the challenge very much comes down to how do we get to a stage where we can be roughly right in a rigorous manner, right? Because I'm pretty sure that you can be roughly right in a scientifically, statistically rigorous manner. So that's what keeps me up at night. Or Corona keeps me up at night, but when that isn't keeping me up at night, it is this issue of what does that system look like, and how do you get the information and the input from that system translated into useful, actionable knowledge that gets fed out to the people that need them and that need them in real time, which I think Alison touched on, which is the time lags is a big problem. So that's not anywhere near close to an answer to any of your questions. It's just a bunch of new questions, but that's what I've got. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Håvard. And it sounds like typical research about it. You go right into diagnosing what are the issues, and you come sort of an amazing way, just as you said, less than a month. So I think this what's interesting, and is actually also going to introduce our next panelist, who's been in that kind of role longer than you, and it would be interesting to hear, sort of, you talk about, how do we then sort of deal with these complex systems? How do we sort of get the right type of data? How do we work with partners and the rest of the organization to get to a better place, etc. So let me bring in you, Stacey, because you have you have a role of overseeing evaluation and organizational learning, and in your case as well, a lot of the ones that need to sort of maybe use the evidence or collect the data or put in place the systems are not sort of some people you can boss around, so to speak. They are other parts of the organization. They are partners. And so what do you anticipate will be the main challenges, in your work on this, and any things you can talk about as well in terms of ideas as well that you've picked up along the way to address some of the issues also that Håvard has brought up. And with your extensive experience with organizational learning, what is the evidence about what works in creating a learning organization?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Marie. Thank you so much. Great question. And thank you also for the invitation to be on this amazing panel. I agree, this is a great learning opportunity. So you asked about the challenges of strengthening evidence use and learning when that function is distributed across the organization, and as Håvard was saying, among our implementing partners as well. It's a really good question. I'm sure it's relevant for all of the panelists here, and I know from the work that I've been doing with Multi-Donor Learning Partnership, which is a partnership of 9 organizations leading in knowledge and learning and development, that this is a common challenge across the whole development sector. So I want to talk about 3 main things, at least 3 main things that we need in order to have an effective evidence culture. First, of course, we need a strong evidence base, and some of the other panelists have spoken to this. In the field of knowledge management, sometimes we talk about this in terms of the stock of knowledge. So a recent example at USAID is our COVID evidence base. This is a set of internal data resources and tools that were developed with the goal of helping agency leaders and staff assess the myriad first and second order impacts of the pandemic. And there's some important characteristics to this evidence base that support learning. So the data is carefully curated from USAID, as well as from publicly available data that comes from external sources, such as the World Bank, the IMF, UNICEF, Johns Hopkins, VDEM, and so on. It covers topics that staff need to know about to develop and manage our programmatic COVID response. And the data ranges from health impacts to data about the economic and household impacts of COVID and the impacts on democratic rights and governance. The tools and resources facilitate evidence use by USAID staff in several ways. So one, the data is pre-vetted, and that makes it easy for staff who have varying levels of data literacy to use. Second, it's robust and credible, so staff can get a holistic picture of COVID impacts and they can have faith in the rigor of the data. And third, it's regularly updated, so staff don't need to seek more recent information on their own. So that's a good example of a knowledge stock that is created in a way to facilitate evidence use. Second, in addition to building the stock of knowledge, we need to facilitate the flow of knowledge among staff and partners and across our programs. So this is the part that has to do with effective systems and processes for storing, accessing, and sharing evidence and knowledge. It involves the technology and also the business processes that are established through organizational policy and formal practice, but it also involves the individual and collective behavior that's shaped more by culture, including, as somebody else mentioned, how leaders signal priorities. the soft incentives around knowledge seeking and knowledge sharing, and the culture and mindsets around acknowledging what we don't know and being willing to take risks to try new approaches and being willing to share what doesn't work as well as what does work. So in both stock and flow, the COVID example that I just gave is really compelling, but it's also a little bit anomalous in that the knowledge base was established all at once rather than over a long period. It was established centrally rather than by different parts of our distributed organization and our partners. And it was established around a challenge that no one feels they need to pretend to have all the answers for. So this makes these institutional and cultural processes that I talked about easier in many respects than they are for other development efforts. The third challenge to establishing effective organizational evidence use is the toughest. And that is that actual learning has to take place, actual learning. And learning is a complicated process that we too often don't give much thought to. It's where we so often falter, and not because we don't know how to achieve this. So in relation to that, I just want to mention work that USAID did on building an evidence base around the contributions that collaborating, learning, and adapting, or CLA, make to improving our organizational effectiveness and our development results. This was a learning agenda around basically what difference does it make to invest in learning. And I'll put the link to the evidence dashboard in the Q&A field in a little bit. There's a lot there. I mention it because there's a lot there that knowledge and learning staff can use to advocate for more attention to how to achieve genuine learning in our organizations. But the key points are the need to pause to actually synthesize and internalize new evidence, and then reflect on its implications specifically for the work that we're engaged in, not generally or generically. And then to understand and have the time and authority to translate those implications into course corrections. So doing all of this requires time, empowerment, analytic skills, and clear institutional processes. It also requires some intangibles such as humility and a team-based appreciative approach versus a culture in which people feel on the hook as individuals to be accountable for everything going to plan and going well. This is hardest because it's often poorly understood and it's nearly always under-resourced. We're simply doing too much too fast to invest the time needed to achieve the full learning process. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to elaborate during the discussion.
Thank you, Stacey. I think that, the actual learning, and I think the way you sort of described it, and we always talk about learning as if it was something easy, and you portrayed it so well. It's an attitude, it's resources, it's time, it's intentional, it's so important. Well, and moving now to the next part, this is the part where I'm trying to use some of the ideas around learning, which is, you make people learn by having to listen to others. So this is where each of you will get to ask one of the other panelists something you want to learn more about that sort of grab your attention. And I wonder, Kumar, could I ask you to start off, since I know you will have to leave early. Is there something you want to ask a panelist about?
Yes, I mean, I'm not quite sure who to direct it to, Marie. Maybe I'll let you direct the question. But I'm really interested. I'm really interested in systems, processes, and the technology that enables the use of evidence. It's the thing that I'm really, as I said before, I'm really thinking about. And I'd be interested to hear from the panelists the lessons that they have around systems and processes and techniques, and whether that's technology enabled or otherwise, that really makes the use of evidence, the testing of whether, again, it shouldn't just be at the beginning, at the concept phase of whether, when you're delivering, are you real-time monitoring where if you're at where you're at, and that feedback loop around. I'd be interested to hear from panelists if they've got interesting thoughts and suggestions on what works best in that area.
Do we have a volunteer?
I guess I'm happy to step in, but I'm not sure. Systems, techniques, processes sort of covers the whole range of work at some level or another. And I'll just hark back to this issue of cost-benefit analysis in the ERR, because it is such a, I think, useful heuristic device for disciplining people and making very clear what is your theory of change. The problem with it is that it often appears rather late in identifying a particular project or approach that's being taken. And that creates a level of conflict with operations who've already invested a lot of time into developing a particular project or intervention. And when the cost-benefit analysis, it tries to then discipline what are the streams of benefits, their timeline, their sustainability, and the assumptions that will make them sustainable are put on the paper. And then, you come back with a number. This is maybe an intro to a question I'll ask later, but that number, a central estimate of kind of your rate of return, your value for money. If it fails that threshold that we have, that hurdle rate of 10%, you throw out what could be a year or longer of investing and preparing a project. But I think it's really important for bringing the entire team around as a process and clarifying to everyone what is driving our expectation of positive results and outcomes from our 5 years of shovels in the ground, whether it's infrastructure or education or policy and institutional reforms that accompany that.
Great. Let me ask, Kumar, will you take one question from one of the panelists before you
Sure. Yep, absolutely. Happy to.
Excellent. So does anybody have a question specifically for Kumar?
So I have one, if you don't mind.
Yes, please, Alison.
Sorry, Harvard, I think I got in before you on that one. Obviously, lots of really interesting, and thank you to fellow panelists for fantastic opening reflections. So, Kumar, in a way, this also applies to all of us, but I'm just taking up Marie's challenge. I mean, it seems to me that you described really nicely the process of using the concept note and the business case very much to sort of crowd in evidence and use it to really interrogate, choices and priorities. But I suppose one of the tests for all of us of the effectiveness of that process is not what we see then going through the pipeline, but what's on the cutting room floor. In a sense, what gets rejected? What don't we see? We don't have any easy metrics for this, but do you have a sense of just how much ends on the cutting room floor and how much is actually, we find a reason to push it through anyway?
So I want to make sure I understand the question there, Alison. When you say what ends up on the cutting room floor, do you mean the ideas that we don't take up? Yeah. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. How you use particularly the concept note process to really filter out what you shouldn't be supporting, rather than using it as a process to find a reason to support particular projects or programs?
Yeah, good question. I'm afraid I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we do have a funnel that we try and capture, and we do try and capture the reasons for why we reject particular projects. We may not be capturing that systematically by category. I know that we do explain it, but we do have a funnel that we try and monitor. So I don't have a feel immediately off the top of my head. I don't want to give you the wrong number as much as anything else. But what I find and what I've been observing, and I'm still sort of relatively new in this particular role. So like Harvard, I've got lots of questions still myself, but I'm finding quite a lot of it's a mix between self-editing and inertia around when the concept notes come together. It's because of the high cost, I think, of getting together a really good concept note and a really good business plan. People very quickly edit through and they refine, and then when they think they've got an idea, they really stick to it and back it and run with it. And even though we're trying to get in really early in on the process, show us your thinking, share the ideas, there is a bit of self-editing that goes on that you never really kind of get to, at least as the central team, that you never quite see. So have we got that perfect right now? I'm not sure we have. I think it is a really interesting area actually to work on, and it comes back to this question around thinking holistically around how you make those how you make that work. And I think it's about the getting those incentives right for people. And as I say, I'm not sure we're perfect there yet, but it's a good question.
Great. Let's Mark, you also had your I think your hand up, but you want to ask, it doesn't have to be Kumar either, but you want to take the next
well, yeah, I would like to, I mean, on this question of learning feedback, an issue that is sort of front burner for us at MCC, but I think probably relevant to all of our institutions, and this is perhaps directed more towards Kumar and Alison, is how we learn real time in projects as they're being implemented. We've been captivated a bit by the idea of this problem-driven iterative adaptation, that really problems and solutions are not well-defined often from the beginning. We may think we know them, and we quickly find out that reality is a bit different from the constructs we use in designing projects. So I'm wondering about what experience or thoughts others on the panel would have about how to bring real-time learning in and get that iterative process working with multiple stakeholders, while recognizing that the engineers, they need to get their roads built on time and dispersed along a Gantt chart that they live by and love. It's a big question, but let me start with that.
Who wants to kick it off?
I could speak to that for a minute. We've done a lot of work on this in USAID over more than 10 years of instituting and strengthening program cycle processes, and really trying to shift from that mode where success equals defining a plan in great detail and then sticking to it, to a mode in which we plan for uncertainty, we plan for adaptation. And the ways that we've done that have had to do with staying front and center in our strategies, our long-term strategies and our shorter-term project and activity designs and implementation plans that we anticipate that we will need to change. So setting that as the focus and intention right up front, and then building in processes to test our hypotheses, often or I say often, but not often, I will say, infrequently, but I think really fruitfully, sometimes in our design, testing different approaches to the same development challenge, and then pausing to take stock, and then course correcting in the midst of implementation. And then investing in some of those things that I was mentioning before around pausing and reflecting, having structured portfolio reviews, structured mid-course stock taking, other processes where we intentionally take stock with the expectation that we may need to course correct. So having that expectation up front and then building it into the design and into the management, and then also in our relationships with our implementing partners, making sure that we are supporting candid conversations so that everybody is open to new information and nobody feels like the strongest incentive is to stick to a plan in some rigid fashion.
Just adding a question, or I remember from the IAG evaluation of learning that one of the recommendations was around, make adaptation the fallback. And if you actually want to keep the track you're on, you have to justify that there are ways of sort of, how sort of the default is sort of also has an effect on the type of behavior you get. So I wonder whether that is also something that one can think of. But Alison, you wanted to add to this.
Well, I think Stacey's example was terrific. I mean, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that I think, as institutions, we tend to have a bit of a default position at times, and I've seen this in when I was working in the UK and also now, and particularly I think in contexts such as this one around COVID, which is do now, learn later. you know, there's an urgency, it's a part of the mission. You know, we need to get the money out of the door, and we'll, you know, reflect when we get a moment later on, and kind of later never quite comes. And there's a tendency, therefore, to keep surging forward, keep pushing forward, because that's the mission. And I think that's very, you know, both understandable, but also very challenging when you're really trying to encourage people to take the time and space and engage in real time with evidence, particularly if it might contradict the path you're on. Now, in the World Bank Group context, it's particularly challenging because we implement through clients and partner countries. There are a lot of legal agreements, sovereign agreements that sort of frame the whole implementation process of World Bank Group loans, and therefore the spaces within which one can realistically look for real-time adjustment are possibly a little less expansive there than they are in some other institutions. But having said that, it's really still a very important part of the agenda, but one in which we're still not seeing huge amounts of progress, I would say. There is a definite kind of rhetorical commitment to the idea of real-time learning, but a real challenge around translating that into action. And I, in all honesty, feel that the pandemic to some extent may have taken us back a few steps on that, as this drive towards, delivering against a very ambitious response has put everyone in the do now, learn later box. But, we'll see. We'll come back and reflect on that soon.
Great. Now, and let me go to you, Håvard. Who do you want to question on that something?
Something I question on many things. I'm when this issue that Alison just brought up now on the real time and the learning during is something that I'm definitely grappling with right now, where we see, when you talk to people on the other side of the table, so to speak, I very often hear that, oh, please give us real-time evaluations. That's what we need. That's how we learn. But when push comes to shove, and you come to them with a real-time evaluation, and no, we don't have time. We're saving lives, and just to be a little bit mean, we're saving lives in Syria. We don't have time to do this, and that's how you square that circle. That's if anybody has insights on that, I would really love to hear. But I also wanted to ask a question to Mark, because I'm sympathetic and extremely curious of this economic rate of return way of thinking that you have. What I was wondering is how you deal with issues that are, somewhat less tangible. So a lot of what NORAD does is not necessarily, building roads and schools, although we do a lot of that as well. But stuff like capacity building, strengthening institutions, support for civil society, where obviously you could, or I'm sure you could use your tools. But how do you think around these more intangible things?
Great question, Mark.
Well, I think you've put your finger on what is, I would argue, probably the most important aspect of aid effectiveness, which are those intangible aspects of policies, institutions, and behavior that needs to align in a way to get at this issue of sustainability in service provision. If you build a water purification plant or a road without proper maintenance, its life expectancy is far below what is planned. And that's more than just sort of allocating O&M. It's also a question of priorities that guide decision-making within countries. And, from a very kind of narrow technical question, the challenge in using our economic rate of return analysis is to apply that to important development topics that don't have nice engineering structural boundaries and parameters to bring in. And that's most challenging for policy and institutional reform, PIR. It's an acronym we toss around a lot. When I arrived at MCC, for the most part, investing in policy and institutional reform was treated as a cost without a benefit stream. And one of our efforts in recent years has been to bring that into our analytic space and think about when you are investing in, let's say, electricity distribution system and you're working with the regulators, what would constitute strengthening a regulatory system, and how could we capture that in looking at benefit streams projected over the future? You're always looking at evidence from the past and thinking about issues in the future. And it's easy to make very stupid mistakes in this. If you assume a road will be perfectly maintained, you can be pretty sure in the countries where we operate that isn't the case, and that assumption has already got you off base. So we try to think carefully through what the parameters ought to be on integrating policy and institutional reform with the infrastructure projects that we take on. But it's tough, and I have to say there are certainly economists that feel this is heroic to put that into a technically rigorous framework. But I think it's also quite important for then how we carry it on to monitoring and evaluation. What are the key parameters you need to then monitor to see whether the assumptions on behavioral response are being followed? And how do you get to that last mile of a project where the connections for water services or power are actually going into households to get the benefits in place? With that last mile problem is one that we also have a lot of thinking to work on.
Great. Now let's see, Stacey, I think you get the last question to anyone in the panel before we move to Q&A.
Great, thanks, Marie. This is a question for Allison. Allison, I've been thinking about this since the other day when we did our pre-event meeting, and you mentioned it again today about supporting the development of judgment skills. And judgment and analytic skills, these are notoriously difficult to cultivate. So I wanted to know if you could say a little bit about how you've done that in your various roles, or how you've seen it done, or what you would suggest in that regard.
Thanks, Stacey. And I'm aware this is something where, as you say, it's notoriously challenging, and there are probably people who are even better placed than I to really hone in on what needs to happen and change. But I would say that, my observation from being around this sort of business for a long time now is that leaving space for that critical thinking and the ability to apply independent judgment, even when everything's coming at you from sort of every angle, and also, you're confronted with a system or a process that you must follow. That in itself is like the magic sauce. And I'm just aware that we need to find a way to support it and nurture it, but also that there is no single solution to do so. I mean, just there on a very micro scale, Stacey, in the work we do in IEG on our evaluation work, I have a very, all my colleagues will know this, I sort of have a big mantra around us, identifying the judgment points in our evaluations and really bringing those out and make it clear. And those judgment points are built around weighing evidence and recognizing the strength of different sources of evidence, and then going through a process of really applying sort of critical thinking and analysis to say, and where do we come up? Where is the tipping point in this evidence? Where does it lead us? And how does that help us make a judgment around the efficacy or effectiveness of the piece of work we're looking at? The way we do it is really trying to build and work through sort of a kind of systematic process of weighing and weighting evidence. Now, it doesn't work every time, and it sometimes can feel a bit laborious, but it does really help us get to, I think, to clear points of judgment. Now, does that happen on the other side of the shop, as it were? Is that happening in the process of project design, for example? Are they going through a process of trying to weigh and weight evidence and how it would lead to judgments about which direction to go in or which components to go with. It's a little bit of an invisible process, I would say, in the World Bank Group. And there are tools and systems that support quality thinking at the design stage. But the pressures are so enormous to get to good quickly that I just wonder whether they crowd out those spaces where we sit back for a moment, apply all our kind of analytical capabilities to say, on balance, where is this taking us? And where do we apply our judgment in terms of what's important? So I don't have a simple answer, but I think there are things we can do. And one for me is weighing up the balance of evidence, getting more than one source and giving it a critical review before we move forward.
Thanks, Alison. That's helpful. And I'm also seeing chat about developmental evaluation, which I think may also be a process that we can use to both manage implementation adaptively and along the way cultivate those analytic and judgment capacities among our staff. Thanks.
Great. So thanks for this excellent interaction and showing that you were listening to each other. So that's great. I'm going to move now to the audience Q&A, which we would have loved to have the audience live with us, of course, but that's not possible. I have curated a few questions that have come through, and I will just basically read them up, 3, 4, and then we'll see how we distribute them, and you can sort of self-select. So the first one is from Dave Ferguson, who's with 3IE, and he says that in a recent interaction with a large foundation representative about joining an effort to make the evidence more accessible in international development, they commented, not many decisions funders make are driven by evidence. And so how might we increase the use of evidence in programming decisions? Another question from Carlos Munoz Brene, which is for Alison and Stacey. What is your experience on policy engagement with challenging findings? Then Caludio Romero is asking to Alison, besides incentives, is there a need for a change in culture so that the work becomes more critical? And I think you partly spoken to it already, but so that would entail engaging personnel who are more research oriented but willing to answer real world questions. What are the necessary processes for this cultural change? And then there's a question from Sabit Ababor Ababulgu to any panelist. At what point of evidence generation do we need to engage policy and decision makers in order to ensure evidence utilization? What are the major factors for not using evidence for policy decision making? That's a great question. And then the last one, I think we will take Claudio Romero for Mark. Does the country selection rationale example provided for MCC mean that when locals are too problematic and there are investment risks, these places may not have a chance of getting out of the bottom? Are there other criteria used to overcome this apparent complex ethical dilemma? Let me see if there are any. I think that's what we'll take, and we'll just go around the room, and you can see what you want to address of these questions. Mark, do you want to start off?
Sure. Maybe I'll quickly answer that last question because it is one that's important, and there are, out of roughly 90 countries that are eligible from the standpoint of their income level for programs at MCC, only about between 25 and 30 of them actually pass our scorecard. And so what about the other 60 countries in which there are millions and millions of poor? And we have a particular program that is separate from our large, $300 to $600 million grant compacts. And this other program, they're called threshold programs, which is working with countries that don't pass the scorecard, but either show a very positive trajectory or are very close to passing and have been close to passing for some time. And these threshold countries, there are, probably 7 or 8 of them now, ones that are quite a distance from passing. Ethiopia, for example, a very large and important country that has not passed. We have a program there. It's being suspended right now for governance reasons, the current turmoil in the north. But we have similar programs across many other countries, and including transitional ones where after a period of being threshold, they transition to being compact countries. Sierra Leone is an example. So we recognize that that problem, but have this threshold approach to try to address getting others through the gateway, so to speak. There were a number of other good questions. Maybe I'll step in as others have a chance to answer as well.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's, and you probably won't have a chance because we're running up against the clock. So I will just ask each the rest of the panelists to say a few words, and then we'll come to your commitments. So maybe Stacey, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Marie. I'm gonna do my best to address 1 or 2 of these, and also some points that have been made in the chat. So Carlos, I think, had asked about experience with policy engagement with challenging findings. And then people are also talking about perspectives that might be a really important complement to those that we've been sharing on this panel that would come from stakeholder communities or the people on the receiving end of the work that we're doing. And I think that one thing that I have noticed over the time that I've been working in development is that there are always competing priorities, but every now and then there are a number of forces that come together to create an opening in the development space. And I think that we're seeing that now, specifically with this point about what about the voices of the people on the receiving end of what we are doing as development organizations? What about systemic racism? What about systemic power imbalances? The legacy effects of colonialism? There is a growing conversation taking place globally that we're now seeing resonating within our organizations, I think, or we're seeing a demand for those to resonate within our organizations. So I think if you think about this as, one of those places where there are challenging findings or perhaps challenging feedback that we're receiving, I think it's really instructive to see how change can come when there is a growing chorus from the people to whom we are ultimately supposed to be the most accountable. So I think whatever we can do to lift our perspective up and out from our own organizations and really look at the most important feedback loop, which is that global feedback loop around what is the status of development? What should that look like globally? What are the very big questions and how are they evolving, particularly from the perspective of people in developing countries? That I think is bringing attention within our organizations to those broader conversations can be a way to really galvanize some important shifts on the policy level. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you. And Alison, do you want to come in next?
Well, thank you. I mean, I just picking up a little bit where Stacey left off there. I mean, I do think we need to, there are 2 things possibly we've spoken less about today, but I think are really important parts of this picture. One is the evidence and knowledge universe that resides with affected communities and populations and within partner countries that sometimes gets left out of the picture by development institutions who privilege particular kinds of evidence and knowledge, and in certainly ones I'm familiar with, often their own. So, you know, we need to recognize this is not a level playing field here, and we have to work very hard, I think, within our positions of privilege within development institutions to really try and ensure that the evidence is being drawn from a very rich pool, including and probably primarily with the countries and in the countries that we work with. I just wanted to make a point, and related to that is also to be very aware that evidence is never neutral and it always exists within a political context. So again, as people who talk, you know, I talk very easily about the role of evidence and how it should be used in a way, but we need to recognize that it's, you know, it's never neutral. Just a quick reflection on the point about dealing with challenging findings, and, you know, working in the evaluation space right now, that is something we think about a great deal. And I agree very much with Stacey that there are moments and spaces and we take advantage of that. But quite frankly, just on a really rudimentary level for us, the key to working with our stakeholders within the World Bank Group on challenging findings is engagement. It's engagement, engagement, engagement. You know, if you take a kind of hit and run approach to providing challenging findings, you're not surprised that doors slam in your face. You know, this is difficult, and it's all about creating and opening the possibility of conversation, sometimes difficult, but one where you engage in a process for you know, bringing together the sides around challenging findings and really trying to find a way forward. So, and my last thought is on culture change. And, you know, I'm yes, of course, it's what we need, but I think we're all at a little bit of a loss, maybe. It's such a big agenda. But one of the things I've noticed is that in large development institutions, there tends to be a set of people who regard themselves as operational, and there are people who regard themselves as research, and there are people who regard themselves as evaluation. We should be all of those things, right? And I think the culture shift is almost about how do we become all of those things? And that, of course, is, I'll leave that out there, but it seems to me that's really what we need to start thinking about.
Yeah, wonderful. I think you know, you're bringing out this panel is bringing out so many important points. I think it's like, just want to sort of also, you know, maybe come towards the end here and saying there's something hopeful here as well. I think this idea, you know, this recognition that evidence is never neutral, and that we've been living in that world for too long, and that maybe we're coming to a shift in realization. I think that's an amazingly hopeful thing. I think we definitely have a way to go, but that's already a good realization. Let me, Håvard, last words from you before you then get to also commit to something.
So Håvard chatted that his building had the fire alarm went off, and he.
Oh, okay. So I think it's okay. All right. Okay. So then actually, then let's do with the ones of us who remain. I would love to hear from each of you. Maybe go now in opposite order, and starting with you, Alison. Is there anything you sort of you want to commit to, or something you want to be trying out, or you know you'll be trying out next year, and partly sort of hopefully incentivized by this panel, and we'll hear back from you next year.
Okay, you're on. And I'm going to cheat ever so slightly, because I'm also going to suggest something that we're also thinking about now, but this panel has reminded me this is super important, and we'll try and pilot a few things.
So contribution.
So this is, I'm doubling up here on the tailwind created by this panel, but also where we're trying to go, which is really trying, from my perspective and our perspective in IEG, to find those critical moments through the project cycle where the kind of evidence we're able to provide is actually most valuable to those both at the design end and the implementation and ultimately the evaluation end of the project cycle, which is to say, let's stop treating this A as a linear process, B as one where what's done at design is set in stone, or C, that we only ever learn and reflect when we get to the point of completion. So, but we want to know, it's quite an art to find those moments where the conversations happen that we really want to crowd in some of the evidence that we can provide. So we're going to pilot a few things to see if we can identify the spaces and influence those spaces with the range of sort of evaluation products that we produce. So I'm happy to come back in a year and say, are we making any progress? But it would be, it's an interesting agenda.
Excellent, you're on. And we now have, you're on record. Okay, over to you, Stacey.
Thanks, Marie. Yeah, so thinking about things that Shruti Patel and David Ferguson were saying in the chat and the Q&A about, well, do decision makers actually use evidence, and skepticism about that. And then also thinking about what Mark was talking about with respect to the evidence chain from the congressional budget decision all the way along the chain. What I would like to commit to is mapping out that evidence chain. And I mean, you know, just trying this out, right? Mapping out the evidence chain, and then doing some analysis around the different links in that chain and what kind of evidence shared in what ways, and, you know, engaged with in which ways actually is most effective at supporting decision making. Because I think that at different points along the chain with different decision makers, there are different types of evidence shared in different ways, different kinds of engagement opportunities that actually are effective. So being a bit intentional about mapping that out and understanding it. Happy to come back next year and share what I've learned.
Excellent, excellent idea. Great, and then over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Listen, it immediately seems to me that this should be sort of part one of an end-part dialogue, because there's so many rich topics here. And I had 3 or 4 questions I could have asked other panelists that we didn't get to. I'm going to cheat a little bit too, the way Alison did, because issues that have come up here, and there was reference from Stacey about testing different approaches, and Alison emphasized the importance of evidence, not just from sort of the technical perspective of our agencies, but on the ground, how critical it is. This notion of using an iterative approach real time to solve problems, as problems define and redefine themselves, is just, I think, so compelling and in need. We do have a partnership with Harvard's Center for National Development, where Matt Andrews works on PDIA, this problem-driven iterative adaptation notion, and trying to incorporate that into our programs. That's more easily done in our threshold projects, but we're just sort of starting this. And so learning from the experience of others and thinking of, you know, taking stock of that. And it's not only on the ground where you need to engage counterparts, it's at home with those that think of the way Alison set it out there, those that think of themselves as operational, and the researchers and the decision makers and the evaluators. We really need to be around a common set of problems to define and learn from. And so I really would like to make a commitment to that. So thank you very much. It's been a great panel, Marie.
No, thank you very much for being willing to engage at such a level, and also for your commitment to sharing these ideas and sharing what you will be trying over the next year, and hopefully, I mean, the panel, you know, you said you had more questions, Mark, so I'm hoping that the panel will also engage offline. So basically, I'd like to thank very much this very distinguished panel and an amazing discussion. And I would like to remind you that we will be hosting monthly webinars on similar topics in the future, and the previous ones are already available online, and this one will be made available. And I urge everyone to sign up for our updates using the link provided by my colleagues in the chat window. And again, if you're on Twitter, please follow us on @3IE News. And goodbye, and thank you so much, and thanks for all the good questions, and see you next year.
Great.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So long now. Stay safe.
Thanks.